Hi, I'm Sasha Ayad. It's November 2024, and here's what's on my mind this month. Is being transgender a cop-out to adulthood? Picture a teenager. She's living through one of the most turbulent and rapidly changing stages in her development. Let's say she's 16, and in the midst of this adolescent chaos, she recognizes that adulthood is just around the corner. Her body's been developing in ways that make her uncomfortable, and everything about becoming an adult woman seems daunting and maybe even a bit scary. Is becoming a trans man a way to sidestep the whole project of female adulthood? Maybe. Today we're going to discuss whether trans identities and medical transition are a cop-out to growing up. First, let's talk a bit about Gen Z. Did you know that people born between 1996 and 2010 take less risks than previous generations? They also reach independence milestones like getting a driver's license or getting their first job much later than their parents or their grandparents did. And rates of high-risk externalizing behaviors, as we call them in psychology, which are things like drinking alcohol or having a lot of casual, unprotected sex, have also gone down with Gen Z. There are several theories about what's going on here. Maybe because this is the internet generation with access to so much knowledge and information, they are better educated and they know about safety and are therefore being more responsible. Maybe they're also being entertained by their screens and social media, so they have no need to get out and party as much. Maybe their screen-based lives have made them less tolerant to distress in the real world, so they're just too anxious to take risks, and they're playing it safe. But I'm skeptical that this generation is actually being safer. Can the teenage desire to challenge authority and engage in risky behavior simply disappear? I doubt it. Instead, risk-taking behavior may still be present, but it's been diverted and transformed into something different. I also suspect that this new manifestation of risk-taking can truly hold young people back from growing up. Now remember that risky behavior is different from healthy risk-taking that helps us grow. And stick around because towards the end of the video, I'm going to explain how maturation and adulthood are related to an acceptance-based personal identity, which is a topic that many of you asked me to elaborate on when I first discussed it in an earlier video. Back to Gen Z. Something we know about this generation is that they're much more open to questioning their gender and sexual identity than previous generations. Polls show that somewhere between 7% and 28% of Gen Z adults identify somewhere within the LGBTQ. So Gen Zers, if you're watching this, during your adolescence, questioning your gender identity can prove to be a double-edged sword. That's what I've found in my work as a therapist with a lot of young people who are questioning their identity. So on one hand, you're rethinking things like masculinity and femininity and subverting the gender binary. It can feel really powerful to make up your own mind about who you are and what you want to be called and what pronouns other people can use for you. You're also taking a risk by living in an alternative identity, one that is sometimes marginalized and very often at the center of our cultural debates. Coming out is like taking a public stance and making demands of the world around you. So all of this can feel really subversive and bold. On the other hand, though, coming out and socially or medically transitioning means you are stopping your birth sex identity in its tracks. When you begin curating a new identity in the other sex role or in a non-binary role, you're sort of dodging the responsibilities and the type of maturation that would have been right around the corner for you in your birth sex identity. If you're a girl, then you don't want to become an adult woman, and if you're a boy, you don't want to become an adult man. And when it comes to medical interventions for younger teens, things like puberty blockers, there's a very literal pharmaceutical halting of development. Then cross-sex hormones synthetically usher a child into a transsexual adulthood away from their natal sex. And yes, I'm using the term transsexual deliberately here because it denotes the medical and cosmetic changes which are part of physical transition. But when a young person takes on a new social or medical identity, what happens to their original self? In the case of an FTM, Does she just get frozen in time there? Is she forgotten and left behind? And what is the child's relationship to the new boy she's trying to become? Is she actually growing up in a new way now as a boy? Or is she simply derailing her true female maturation? To answer these questions, I'd like to remind you of a story which was near and dear to me in my childhood, and maybe it meant something important to you too. And that story is Peter Pan. You remember the plot, right? Peter Pan is an adventurous kid who never wants to grow up, and also he can actually literally fly, and recruits a new friend, Wendy, and her little brothers to fly up with him to Neverland, where the Lost Boys live full-time in this fantasy world. Now, altogether, they have run-ins with pirates and mermaids and fairies and get into all kinds of shenanigans. In the Hook remake starring Robin Williams, I especially love the food fight scene where, using their imagination, the Lost Boys conjure up an incredible spread of food. It appears right out of thin air, and they proceed to hurl these beautiful, colorful globs of blue and orange pie at each other across a giant table. It's kind of hard to explain. I'll just show you. That movie. Anyways, Wendy decides to leave Neverland and return to her real life in London. And eventually she settles down, gets married, and starts her own family. Now, Peter is devastated to lose her because in the story, Wendy represents nurturing and a kind of motherly love for Peter and the Lost Boys. They are called the Lost Boys after all. So the story of Peter Pan offers us a warning. While fantasy and whimsy and imagination can be a really fun distraction, getting stuck there is dangerous. The Peter Pan story teaches us that we can't really grow up and become mature if we're trapped in a fantasy that's untethered from the real world. There's even a contemporary term called Peter Pan syndrome, which was the title of a 1983 book by Dr. Dan Kiley, who described adult men who were struggling with responsibility and emotional maturity. And in some cases, I think this concept can apply to trans identities too. Let me explain what I mean. It's always easier to live in a hypothetical fantasy than it is to face the real-world challenges that are particular to us, to our own personality, to our life circumstances, and to our physical abilities and limitations. Gender-questioning teens, in my experience, often have really vivid and rich imaginations and can picture themselves being happier and more confident as someone new. It becomes tempting to pursue that fantasy and avoid the painstaking work of developing themselves from their current starting point. So in this way, a trans fantasy is an escape strategy to avoid the difficulties, traumas, or self-loathing that people are dealing with right now in the moment. And when families decide to move beyond this fantasy and medicalize their child's identity, things can get dark. Childhood medicalization can actually destroy sexual function. I mean, kids don't care about their sexual function, of course, because they're just children. And many of them, in fact, are grossed out or really intimidated by the prospect of having sex or having their own kids in the future. But the doctors, why are some doctors willing to prematurely compromise a child's future sexual function? I see this as a morbid medical Peter Panning of sorts because it keeps the patient in a permanent childhood sexual state, even as they grow into adults in the future. And another strange thing about medicalization, I can imagine that young people taking hormone injections, for example, likely feel that they're undergoing a kind of rites of passage to adulthood. Girls are promised, you're going to go through a male puberty when you take testosterone. It almost sounds like another shot at adolescence, like a do-over. Maybe our 16-year-old girl that we talked about earlier thinks, this time I'm going to be going through the right puberty. The trans medical journey has other superficial similarities to a rite of passage. Think about it. With surgery, for example, there's a willingness to voluntarily endure pain. Medical interventions and appointments and hospital visits separate the adolescent from his peers. He's symbolically leaving the protection and carefree experience of childhood, and a difficult trial ushers him into adulthood. And of course, after that treacherous journey, he hopes he will be transformed by it. But is this a real psychological or maturational transformation? Is this transformative in ways that truly matter? Now, I'm not saying that social and medical transition necessarily keeps someone locked into a fantasy state. In many ways, transition requires young patients to face lots of difficult realities. For example, only after medical transition steps do some people recognize the limits of what modern medicine can and can't do. I always say medicine is not magic. So if their aesthetic fantasies didn't get actualized by the hormones and the surgeries they had, then all of a sudden they have no choice but to look for self-compassion. Maybe it's too little too late. And certainly there are other people who feel satisfied with the outcomes of these medical interventions. But inevitably, they're still going to have to face some biological realities and health consequences and other facts of life as a trans person. The point is that everyone comes face to face with reality, and fantasies will always collide with the truth eventually. So in some ways, a transition fantasy can be an escape mechanism, and facing reality at any stage of the process can quickly pull someone back down to earth and reveal a more grounded understanding of life in a human mammal's body. But for a time, I think it's possible to push the cognitive dissonance aside and remain in a childlike state of denial, which attempts to reject reality altogether. And I think this is what happens when dogmatic slogans replace genuine thought and reflection. Because thoughtlessly parroting a slogan is not a sophisticated or mature way to make sense of things you're going through or to argue your point. Remember my recent video where I introduced this concept of a denial-based personal identity versus an acceptance-based personal identity? Now, if you haven't seen it yet, don't worry, you can watch it afterwards. Basically, a denial-based personal identity is kind of what I'm talking about here. It's a refusal to accept basic realities and instead leaning on slogans and word games and beliefs that can't be proven. And I think that is a sign of being stuck in a childlike way of thinking, a Peter Pan syndrome. Let me illustrate this with an incredible example that really blew up on YouTube over the last few weeks. Surrounded is the name of a debating game which is filmed and put on YouTube by Jubilee. And on this episode, Ben Shapiro, who's a conservative commentator, was debating a trans man about abortion. The trans man jumped around from one argument to the other about sexual assault and freedom and the American dream. To be honest, it was a bit scattered and hard to follow, but the debate topic was supposed to be whether abortion is morally indefensible. Now look, I don't know this person. I'm really not trying to pick on this trans guy. For our purposes, though, I just think it's really interesting, this idea that he puts forward, that trans men can get pregnant and therefore men can get pregnant. An acceptance-based framework for identity, one that is mature and in touch with reality, might sound like this. Trans men are females, and only females can get pregnant. So since I'm a trans man and I'm taking testosterone, if the hormones haven't compromised my body's ability to get pregnant yet, then it is possible for me to get pregnant because I'm female. I've medically and aesthetically changed the appearance of my body so I can live more seamlessly in society's male sex role, but that doesn't mean I'm not female anymore. So you'll notice that having an acceptance-based personal identity in this example doesn't mean we're denying the existence of trans people or forcing anyone to make specific decisions about medical interventions. In fact, it's actually a much healthier, grounded way to describe the realities of a transgender identity and trans medicalization. And having an acceptance-based view of reality also gives people more clarity so they can decide on whether or not a social or medical identity is actually the best strategy for their life. But as we've discussed today, children, teens, and young adults can end up using a trans identity to dodge healthy development, the kind of development we all have to take on to become genuinely mature, whole adults. Now, to learn more about acceptance-based identities, you can check out my What's on My Mind video from October, or you can find it on the Substack post from last month. Now, if you're just watching this on my YouTube channel, please be sure you're subscribed to Substack. That's the only place to get the rest of this month's newsletter. So if you want to read about my thoughts on tomorrow's election, the Netflix documentary, Tell Them You Love Me, and see me preparing Egyptian sandwiches, you'll have to go over to my Substack. And I also talk about some of the questions that I covered in my recent live Q&A, so please follow the link in the description. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.